as well as the workforce in general. Many people will have to work with AI. They may not have to be technology specialists, but they will have to understand how it works. I think of lawyers, of doctors, of any kind of, most of the professional profiles that we can think of. And then we need to raise the number of technology specialists. I would say that probably the biggest challenge we have right now, and we are about to publish the third draft that will be published. I want to make this very clear because in these days I hear a lot complaints that Europe has weak competitiveness in AI because of the AI Act. Well, I'm sorry, I cannot agree to that. And we work very closely with the member states because part of the enforcement and the governance of the AI Act is indeed under the responsibility of the member states and of market surveillance authorities in the member states. So we have introduced in the legislation itself some ways of being able to modify parts of the legislation.
Welcome to the Regulating AI podcast. Join host Sanjay Puri as he explores the dynamic and developing world of artificial intelligence governance. Each episode features deep dives with global leaders at the forefront of regulating AI responsibly, tackling the challenges using AI can bring about head-on and enabling balance without hindering innovation.
Welcome to another episode of Regulating AI, the podcast where we explore the most pressing issues in AI governance, ethics, and policy. I'm your host, Sanjay Puri, and today we are honored to have with us Dr. Lucilla Sioli, Director of the EU AI Office at DG Connect, European Commission. Lucilla has been a key figure in shaping the EU's AI policies, playing a leading role in the implementation of the AI Act. She has also led major initiatives, including the AI Pact, General Purpose AI Code of Practice, and Invest AI. Today, we are going to discuss how the EU AI Office is driving global AI governance, how AI regulation can balance innovation and safety, and what lessons the world can learn from Europe's approach. Lucy, welcome to the Regulating AI podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Wonderful. Lucy, we have a global audience, policymakers, think tanks, civil society advocates, entrepreneurs. So from their perspective, you launched the EU AI Office in June 2024. What has been the most surprising challenge you have encountered in the first few months?
Well, that's a very good question indeed, because the challenges have been many. There is maybe a high-level one about the fact that, of course, many things happened in the field of AI in terms of model releases and simply technological changes that we, as a nascent European AI office, had to follow, to monitor, to be updated about. But then there was a second, more mundane challenge, which is the challenge of recruiting. I was given the possibility, which is probably rare in a public organization, to recruit a significant number of new colleagues in the European Commission, working in particular on the safety of artificial intelligence. And I had the possibility, and this is a positive challenge for me, in particular because I was impressed by the interest that our call received, and by the enthusiasm of many, many young people in the European Union, but also beyond the European Union, who are interested to work on these kind of topics. And that's really refreshing.
Lucy, since you talked about the issue of talent, just can we have a follow-on? Because we have a global audience. You know, it's said that Europe has some of the best AI talent, and obviously global firms also use that. Talk a little bit about the talent to our audience in terms of you, obviously, when you were recruiting, you must have seen wide variety of people across. And what is Europe doing to kind of nurture and grow this talent? Because really it is all about talent, right, Lucy?
Let's say that talent is a very, very important part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, here we are recruiting right now technology specialists, so people that have a strong background in AI, and in particular in our AI office, we're looking for people with a background in the safety of AI. It is not, it's not something, it's not a topic yet that is very common in university studies, also because safety in particular of the models is a trend that emerged relatively recently for university curricula to adapt to this kind of topics. So it is not super easy to find people with this background, but we are finding them across the European Union. Sometimes they went to study outside the European Union. But now what we really need to focus on is also, well, for the AI office, we are also interested in finding lawyers that have experience, for example, in digital or AI and the law and the rule of law, and people who have experience in policy making, but always in the field of AI. And secondly, on a higher level, we put in place policies in the AI office also to raise the skills level of the Europeans in the area of AI. And here you have to intervene on citizens that have to understand what AI is, and maybe it's not as bad as the way it is portrayed in the media, as well as the workforce in general. Many people will have to work with AI. They may not have to be technology specialists, but they will have to understand how it works. I think of lawyers, of doctors, of any kind of, most of the professional profiles that we can think of. And then we need to raise the number of technology specialists.
So it's a wide variety across many, many sectors, lawyers, doctors, others that are coming in. So I think the good news from our listener standpoint is that European Union really possesses a wide range of skills in this area, and the future from that talent perspective is pretty strong. Lucy, you also have been meeting with AI safety offices around the world. Where do you find key areas of alignment or maybe divergence in approaches as far as AI regulation is concerned?
Well, when it comes to regulation, so the European Union was the first jurisdiction to put in place a regulation on AI. Now, if I consider the countries that form the network of safety institutes, there are regulations also in Korea, and there are discussions in other countries like Australia, and there were also discussions in Canada. There are pieces of legislation on AI also in the United States, in some states. We all have slightly different approaches, but still we find our conversations very useful, our exchanges very useful, because we have very similar objectives. And as I said earlier, the science, in particular the science of safety of AI, is relatively recent. And so there is a great need that we exchange information in terms of methodology, in terms of benchmarks, in terms of tools that we can use to evaluate and benchmark the different models. So this is where our conversation is mostly going, on top of even conducting joint testing approaches, which are also very interesting.
So a lot of conversations as the EU has established a real leadership role in terms of some of the governance and AI perspective that's happening. Lucy, also, I think the first draft was published, and I think of the general purpose AI code of practice, and probably you're working on, I think the second draft was published, and you're working on maybe even the third. What have been some of the most challenging aspects to align among different stakeholders here?
Well, there have been many different challenges, because this is a code of practice which gathers 1,000 members in terms of stakeholders. So that's many, many different people. And it includes the model providers, of course, but also industry that uses the models and may develop systems on top of those models. It includes civil society organizations. It includes academics. So it includes a variety of different interests. And what the code of practice does is to try to find a balance and a compromise between the different parties and the different needs that are expressed under the different interests. So, for example, the model providers, of course, they don't want to have too much red tape, rightly so. And they also want to make sure that their confidential information is respected, so that they are not asked to disclose relevant information for their businesses. And then, of course, on the other side, we may have other groups that instead would like to have a greater control to make sure that the models that are being used are actually safe for citizens. I would say that probably the biggest challenge we have right now, and we are about to publish the third draft that will be published in the next days, is the issue of copyright. So the issue of copyright, meaning that the copyright holders, the right holders, would like to be able to assess if some of their content has been used in the training of the general purpose models. But it's very good that the discussion is going, because of course right holders need to be fairly remunerated, and model providers need to have a lean way of training their models.
So, Lucy, you made some very important points. One is there are over 1,000 stakeholders that you're balancing. So I want to address that because our listeners are taking lessons from you around the world, because you have, like I said, you are ahead of everybody in that. The second thing you're talking about is the copyright issue, which is a very, very important issue for creators who are there. There is this concept of fair use in terms of the use of copyright materials. Is that something that you have thought about, or is that going to be up to the courts? Because in the US, it's working its way up to the Supreme Court in terms of the copyright issue of the use of data for general purpose large foundation models. What are your thoughts, or has that been a discussion in terms of that?
Our discussion is not in terms of the fair use, because in Europe we have a different approach. We have a European Copyright Directive, which basically says that text and data mining is allowed unless right holders opt out from the point of view of their content. And in that case, the opt-out has to be respected by the companies that would like to use that particular content to train their model. So we come from a different perspective, and we are trying to, the AI Act does not modify the European Copyright Directive. The AI Act is simply asking companies and players to respect the European copyright law. And then through the code of practice, we are trying to provide a practical way to implement the way that this directive can be respected.
No, that's very helpful. Lucy, the other issue we talked about is this 1,000 stakeholders, and I want to kind of follow up on that. There is this discussion that goes on about how to balance regulation with innovation, which the EU is obviously trying to do in a big way. How are you, when you look at it, how is that perspective going on from how to make sure that innovation flows, because this is a very dynamic organization and with such a large stakeholders that you have? What are your thoughts in terms of how to balance that?
So for me, it may not be fully correct to talk about balancing regulation and innovation, because the term balancing makes me think that there is a trade-off between the two. And I'm convinced that there is no trade-off between the two. I think that if people trust the technology, people and businesses will use the technology. that creates demand, and that creates incentives for companies to invest in that technology. So trust is necessary for innovation to take place. It is true that any kind of rules may come accompanied by requirements and some cost of compliance, which should not, however, be taken as a bad word. I mean, cost of compliance is necessary if there is a particular issue with the technology, and it's the cost of making sure that trust is there. Still, we as policymakers have to make sure that the cost of compliance is as small as possible. And this is what we are trying to do, including with the AI Act. The AI Act is a risk-based act, meaning that it introduces rules that are commensurate to the risk that the technology or the use of the technology poses. So we are not regulating artificial intelligence, all the applications of artificial intelligence. We are only regulating a small set of these technologies, in particular the ones that are particularly risky from the point of view of violating fundamental rights and safety. But for the rest, which I would say probably 90% of the market, we're not regulating anything. And I want to make this very clear because in these days, I hear a lot complaints that Europe has weak competitiveness in AI because of the AI Act. Well, I'm sorry, I cannot agree to that. Not only because the AI Act is not even fully applicable, and it's not, and it will not be applied retrospectively, but also because it will only concern a very small number of companies that have made the choice of developing AI applications that are risky from the point of view of the fundamental rights and the safety. And in 95% of the cases, we are not saying you cannot develop this technology, but we are saying when you develop it, please be transparent about it. Check that the data are okay, check that everything is documented, check that you have given enough information to the user so that you minimize incidents, check that there is human oversight. And by doing this, which is probably what any serious data scientist would do when developing such an application, I mean a high-risk application, I think that I don't find it particularly invasive in terms of compliance cost.
So I think, again, for our listeners, I think she's making a very important point that majority or over 90% or plus applications do not even have to worry about some of these things, and these are only for some very high-risk applications. And the argument about the balance between innovation and regulation is in some ways a false argument, because it's most industries, whether you're looking at aviation or medicine, etc., have some kind of a built-in compliance, and we don't complain about those things because we take it as a granted. So I think that's a very, very important point that you're making for our listeners around the world, because this has been a big topic. Lucy, also for our listeners who are learning from you, how are you going to balance this regulation within 27 EU states? Because several countries, like take United States, have 50 states within them. Australia has different provinces and others. So they're all looking to see how can they learn from you as to how you're balancing. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, first of all, I would like to point out to the fact that in the European Union, where we have 27 member states, we have one AI regulation. So this is very important, because I can tell you that until a couple of years ago, all countries and all governments wanted to introduce regulation in AI. If we did not have this one AI Act, we would run the risk in Europe to have 27 acts. And it's important to have only one, because then the developers of AI know the rules, and they know that the moment they put on the European market one of their products, it doesn't matter which country it is. From that point on, it will have access to the whole market of the European Union, which, by the way, is a very big market. And we work very closely with the member states because part of the enforcement and the governance of the AI Act is indeed under the responsibility of the member states and of market surveillance authorities in the member states. Because the way this AI Act works is there are some checks that a deployer of the technology has to put in place if that system is high risk before it puts the system on the European market. And then later, if there is an incident, then there is an authority, a market surveillance authority from a member state, the same member state where the incident took place, can go and check if the deployer had followed all the rules and had made all the necessary checks and is or is not responsible for the incident. So we have to make sure at the European level that these market surveillance authorities work in a coherent way. So even if the legislation is one, in the implementation phase, we have to make sure that the market surveillance authorities all work in very coherent ways. And for this, we have set up a board of member states, so where we meet regularly and where we also meet with the market surveillance authorities to exchange information, practices. Also, if there is a case that concerns an AI system which affects more than one country, then there is also a dedicated process where the Market Surveillance Authority informs the European Commission, and then the investigation takes place jointly at the European level.
No, so this is very helpful for our listeners who are not from the EU. That what I think Lucy is saying is that if they had not put this thing together, companies would have had to deal with maybe even 27 different rules and regulations and had to hire lawyers to deal with each and each and each. And only large companies can do that who have the resources, but smaller companies would have not been able to do that. And that's the same issue in the United States and other parts of the world, is what I think Lucy is saying. And they have a coordinated system for doing this. Lucy, that's very helpful. Now, the one other question that comes in is that AI is moving so rapidly, almost on a daily basis. Things keep changing, as you know. And the AI Act has specific provisions for general purpose AI models. How do you plan to keep some of these provisions relevant as the technology keeps evolving? If you can tell our listeners a little bit in terms of how do you keep things as AI technology keeps changing?
So we have introduced in the legislation itself some ways of being able to modify parts of the legislation without going through the full review of the legislation. Because going through a full review of a legislation takes a long time. Mm-hmm. So we have kept certain elements in ways that can be updated through faster instruments that we call in the European Union implementing acts or delegated acts. For example, we have a list of use cases that are captured by our provisions in an annex, and we can modify this annex. Of course, we have to show evidence if we want to add another use case, so we still have to work a lot before we can modify the list, but rightly so. But then, legally speaking or technically speaking, we just modify it by introducing an act that takes a couple of 2 or 3 months, let's say, to get through in the mechanisms of the European Union. And so we have done this for different elements of the legislation that are likely to be updated. I'll give you another example, is the threshold of computation, the flop threshold that we have for capturing the general purpose AI models with systemic risk, which is something that obviously may increase as models become larger, or maybe in the future even decrease, we will see.
So there are provisions for our listeners for the AI Act to evolve as new technologies come in, I think, and that's the point that Lucy is making, because that's a very important point. Lucy, lately there has been a lot of conversation about open source. I'm sure you've heard with DeepSeek and other stuff. Can you tell our listeners in terms of what is your perspective when you look at open source technology, which has open weights listed clearly?
Well, look, in the European Union, we are very supportive of open source because open source, well, not only we have very strong talent in the development of open source, it's been a sort of like traditional skill in the European Union. But it is also the opportunity to have many different models. It offers choice. It offers many benefits. Also, if you want, from the democratic point of view. On the other hand, as you say, it may facilitate some attacks, cyber attacks, or other. And so we think that we still want to see the development of open source, and we want to use open source in the European Union. But we think, of course, that the developers of open source have to make sure that they take certain steps to protect their models and make them robust against possible cyber attacks or others.
So very supportive of open source, but obviously there have to be certain guidelines that they need to follow to make sure that they are safe. Lucy, from a standpoint of small businesses and startups, how are you making sure that they can also thrive under the AI Act's requirements? Because they don't, as I mentioned earlier, they don't have the resources of large companies. They don't, they can't engage large teams of lawyers or auditors, etc. So, talk to our listeners who are startups, early stage companies, small, medium sized companies who might be a little concerned in terms of compliance with the EU AI Act.
They shouldn't be concerned because, first of all, the AI Act includes some simplification requirements for the smaller companies, for example, in terms of risk management and quality management. So there are some simplification in terms of information provision, and certain elements are simply lighter for small, medium enterprises. But they don't need to be concerned because, as I was saying earlier, what we are asking to do in most cases is a self-assessment of the transparency requirements that companies have to put in place in relation to an AI system. And this is what many companies do anyway. And in fact, I can tell you that I often speak to startups and SMEs, and I do know a lot of startups that actually don't have a problem in putting in place these requirements, and they actually see the advantage of offering trustworthy AI, and that are clever enough to use the safety and the trustworthiness of their AI systems as a reputational brand for their market.
So I think what Lucy is saying is that it is actually, in most cases, a self-certification, but also it becomes a differentiator where you can put this kind of a branding that it is a trustworthy AI, and it really separates you from other companies maybe who don't have that kind of a level. So that's pretty helpful. Lucy, the AI Act, the AI Pact has attracted about 87 organizations, 74 from which are non-EU. This is as of now, and it keeps changing and growing every day. What does this international interest tell you about the global impact of the EU AI regulation?
It's very significant. There is, as you said, 187 companies that signed up to the AI Pact, and a number of them is not European. It's actually American. And I am and not only American, because I think that we also have companies from Korea and from other countries. What I always find surprising is how useful also the non-European companies find the AI Pact. I mean, they're very enthusiastic about it, and they also use it to improve their reputation with their clients. So we, in turn, use these, let's say, larger companies that signed up to the commitments of the AI Pact to learn from them how they are implementing these commitments, because the commitments at the end of the day are requirements of the AI Act. So we see how they implement them, and then we try to propose this to the smaller enterprises. So in the AI Pact, in reality, we have two circles. We have the circle of the companies who sign up to the commitments, who give us feedback on the implementation of the commitments themselves. And then we have a much larger circle of companies that are following our webinars, our explanations about the AI Act and its implementation, to which we propose the implementation of the smaller circle as an example and a facilitation of their compliance.
So that's really separates them, and there is absolutely a global drive towards joining this. So that's very helpful to know. Lucy, you also emphasized the role of AI factories in Europe's AI strategy. Tell our listeners, how will these contribute towards EU's AI strategy?
In the EU AI strategy, we want to build an AI continent. We want Europe to be an AI continent. And we are a very different continent from, say, the United States, because we have developments in the European Union are basically driven by startups. Developments in particular in generative AI, they're driven by startups. So our policy is about making available resources to these companies to be able to train their models, as the training of the models is normally, the most expensive, let's say, stage of development of the models themselves. And that's why we have made available our public network of supercomputers. The European Union started this exercise a few years ago, not for AI, but for simply data processing, and which has already existed, including AI, for many years. But I'm saying well before the big general purpose AI models were born. And now we are in the process of upgrading the supercomputers with better AI capabilities, making more GPUs. And we are looking at the future where we also want to build gigafactories, meaning factories with also important data centers, with even more GPUs if possible, which can really be used for the training of the large models, not only of the startups, but also science models, for example, by universities and other researchers.
So a lot of resources. I think, Lucy, what you're saying is to create this Europe becoming an AI continent. There is also this Invest AI program, which is kind of putting in a lot of resources. Can you just briefly talk a little bit about that? I think there's about a $200 billion that is invested in, for our listeners who are thinking about some of the opportunities there, Lucy.
Yes, well, the 200 billion euros investment includes commitments also made by European companies investing in the European Union. And on top of that, we are considering the possibility of having a supporting kind of fund, because you see, in the European Union at the moment, if there is a weakness, is limited capital financing. This is both from the public and from the private sources. So we want to stimulate private investment. We are thinking of a fund. We are still reflecting about it, and we will come forward with a proposal at a later stage. But this is going to be important because it's going to, on the one hand, support partly the so-called gigafactories, because the gigafactories are so big that they cannot be supported by subsidies, by public subsidies. They will need private investment, and we are thinking of facilitating and stimulating this private investment. And on the other hand, of course, we would like to be able to support also the scale up of our startups, in particular providing the generative AI models so that then they can become stronger and also work with other European industrial sectors to make sure that AI is integrated in all in our industrial sectors, and that will bring the comparative advantage of the European Union.
So for our listeners, there is this gigafactories. There's also now a conversation about putting together a fund because, as I think Lucy pointed out in my conversations with a lot of entrepreneurs, uh, there is this desire to have more of a funding opportunity, especially when you talk about Series A, Series B, Series C, because Lucy, AI companies need larger investments just because of the processing power and data and things of that nature. But that's also being considered by the European Union. Lucy, are there certain sectors within the EU that you think will have where AI will have a major impact in terms of industries? Are there certain sectors when you look across? And this is for our listeners who might be thinking, "Hey, I have a company. I'm maybe in health or maybe in this and that." What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are many sectors in the European Union where AI can really benefit. I would, first of all, I think in all the sectors of the economy, I cannot think of any sector that can do without AI. Even construction and agri-food need AI, and they're already using it very well. Then, of course, healthcare, as you mentioned, automotive, manufacturing. Robotics is not a sector, but I think that robotics is very important promise for the future, for the impact that AI can have, and the European Union is quite strong in the field of robotics. But as I said, defense, unfortunately, in these days, we have to think a lot of defense, and I think AI is very widely used in that sector as well.
So across a broad spectrum, whether it's in health, even defense, construction, so it's really
Financial services, tourism, I mean, it doesn't have to
tourism.
be only heavy industry, it
Yeah.
can also be services, of course.
Oh, absolutely.
Entertainment, I mean, I can't think of a sector which would not be affected by AI. And the public administration, of course.
Yeah. Even in the administration, public administration services to citizens, I think those are also applications. Um, Lucy, you have in the past mentioned regulatory sandboxes many times. Uh, can you tell our listeners how are these being implemented across the EU? Or just what is your brief definition of a regulatory sandbox?
But the regulatory sandbox is a controlled space where startups and small companies in Europe can go and test their AI systems if they have a doubt, a question about the level of risk, and they can test their system in the presence of a relevant competent authority so that they can discuss with the authority if they have to be careful with something that may stem from the AI Act and then adjust the innovation accordingly. And there will be one regulatory sandbox in every member state, and of course, the services for the startups will be for free.
Wonderful. So it's a, an enclosed environment, in a safe environment where some of these startups can come in and, test out their applications, and it will be in each member state. Lucy, EU is leading in from a regulatory governance framework, but other countries, as you talked about, whether it's South Korea, Australia, Japan, India, are putting their frameworks together. How do you make sure that the EU framework is still aligned or do you think it's incumbent on some of these countries to align themselves with you, or do you also have to are you keeping yourself aware of what is happening with other countries?
Of course, we are always in discussion with other countries, and because we were the first, we are able to put in place what is known as the Brussels effect, so that those who come later do look at our AI Act. And I noticed that the approach is being replicated in Brazil, for example, in the proposal that was on the table in Canada, but even in some of the proposals that were in Sacramento, and some of the concepts also in Australia. So I think that there is a Brussels effect, and we speak with each other quite a lot. International cooperation in this area is very important because technology does not stop at borders. And so I think it will be simpler also for all companies if we all try to align towards similar international standards.
Finally, Lucy, I have like a zillion questions, but I also understand your busy schedule. But if there were some message that you were to look to give to other countries, other regions who are looking to set up policies, or folks who are looking at working in the EU, what would be your message? You've been through this now, uh, the challenges, the problems, the opportunities. As you said, bringing 1,000 stakeholders, 27 countries. If you were to give one or two pearls of wisdom or advice to other countries or leaders who are listening to you, what would that be?
It's very important to be open to many stakeholders and to hear different points of view. And there is a lot of benefit in learning from the different views, even when opposing. And I will certainly recommend to keep all processes as open as possible, of course, always in a practical way. There will be a lot of challenges, there will be a lot of mountains to climb, but one should never then lose the final objective, which is at the end of the day the possibility to make sure that we live in a world where the technology can be controlled and the technology can be used to the benefit of our societies and our economies and not to the detriment of it. So it takes resilience, but it's an objective that can be met.
So it takes resilience, be transparent, also focus on how the technology can help people. I think those are uh, very, very valuable insights from you. Lucy, this has truly been a very, very insightful conversation, and your leadership in AI governance is really helping shape the future of responsible AI, and we really appreciate your time today. And for our listeners, if you want to stay updated on AI policy, please follow, Lucy on LinkedIn and check out EU AI Office's latest updates. And thank you for joining on the Regulating AI podcast. If you enjoyed this discussion, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and share this podcast. Until next time, keep questioning and let's build an AI future that benefits all. Lucy, this has been very, very helpful and insightful, and we really hope to have you back again with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.